All right. Well, my name is Christopher Busby,
And I'm Brian Hill.
and we are both history nerds. How else would we describe ourselves? Political nerds.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, social fabric nerds, maybe
Uh,
a little.
I'm Brian is better at the history stuff. I am definitely I'm a pre-med student or heading into medical school, so I'm a little bit more into the sciences and health aspects. And Um, I don't know anybody who can quote obscure historical figures more than Brian.
But if you're out there and you want to join us, you're free to do so for the future.
um, but yeah, we did a show a couple months back on impeachment. We both got kind of caught up in our lives, um, and now it seems like impeachment, which was going to dominate 6 months, 9 months of the news up until the election, is going to be so far removed from anyone's mind that we won't even begin to talk about it.
You talked about it. You said it was a couple of months ago, and it was, and it does feel like a lifetime ago. It felt like that was last year, or even more so. Crazy.
And it was all anyone could think about at the time. But now you could ask 100 people, and not one of them would think of impeachment was a top issue.
Yeah.
Um, and so we are now in a once in 100 year plague. Um, I think that's a probably fairly apt way to describe it.
You've had
None
a
of us ever
pandemic,
seen
but
it
the last
like
time the U.S. was really affected by one was about 102 years ago. So you hit it right on the head there.
it. But yeah, we are in unprecedented times. Uh, you know, we've had a lot of things we've gone through as a country: Vietnam, we've gone through the Cold War, World War II, we've gone through, you know, oil shortages, we've gone through crazy times, and some people have seen some crazy stuff, but we've never completely stopped as a nation throughout all of it like we have right now.
Not in the last three generations or so. Yeah. And even then you also had a well, they call it a world conflict, at least a pan Europe and America conflict, World War I, that also dominated the headlines. So unprecedented is a really good descriptor right now, I would think.
Well, and I think it's frustrating for a lot of people because we're facing a conflict, and American mentality has always been on: we face an enemy, we got to beat them, and
Right.
there's no beating this enemy. We are powerless to stop it, except for to just go home and, you know, wait it out.
Yeah.
And that's difficult for Americans. We are about beating the bad guy. That is who Americans are.
Yep. Selflessly sacrificing to do that. And in fact, the last time we did have a pandemic, it was World War I, and it was, hundreds of thousands of us shipping over to Europe at one time to go beat the bad guy. And in World War II, it was a similar story. I think it's really difficult to look at. There are all kinds of memes right now, people sitting on the couch, and it was, you're a lazy scumbag 3 months ago, and now you're an absolute hero just for staying home. And that's difficult,
Mhm.
I think, to for a lot of mentalities, but for Americans, you want to get out and do it. Just 3 years ago, you and I both were heavily affected by Hurricane Harvey, and what was the first thing that happened the moment the clouds dissipated? Maybe not even then. Is hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets collecting clothes and food, tearing out drywall. And I can't think of almost anybody that I know that didn't do something or all of that, right afterwards. The whole mentality after some sort of tragic event or life-changing event is to engage, to try and make it right. And there's not you can't get out in the streets and make it right. You have to do exactly the opposite. And I think that's really tough, for anybody, but particularly for the USA.
Well, and it's not the only concept we're having to change on its face. I mean, for, part of the American ideal has been that we we are people that need to build up towards a better future. And part of that understanding is that, we are all expected to want to climb the social hierarchy of the ladder. And, down at the bottom of that ladder are our service workers who are on the front lines right now of trying to make sure that our society is stable. So things that are like sanitation workers, people that are keeping our water flowing, people working at grocery stores, retail outlets that are deemed essential, people that we told get a better job, we're now seeing just how important they are, because they're the last line between us and anarchy
Right.
and complete society falling apart. Those baggers at HEB, those people checking out, they're keeping our society from falling apart at this moment. And for all my life, that was the job you didn't want to wind up getting.
Right.
And so we're having to question at this point our fundamental assumptions of what's essential, what's important.
Yeah.
And somebody who is creating digital graphics to be used on an ad campaign isn't as important as the grocer at HEB right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're having to completely reassess our values during this time of crisis.
Sure. And I think, as well, to the people creating graphics or the people doing things from home, it's been, just in my experience and a lot of other people over the last couple of weeks, kind of reevaluating what actually does need to be, like, what does everybody's job look like in this last week and a half? And then what you're looking at a structure. So working in American public education, a structure that's 150 years old, and how many assumptions did we have about how it was supposed to work before 2 weeks ago that have now, I mean, you may go back to it and it may resume some semblance of the structure it had before, but it will always be altered by this. And interesting questions about, I think probably a lot of people who said, well, why can't we do more work remotely or digitally connected? And the answer was always, well, we don't think it's going to work. Well, here's an interesting test case for all of that, but
I mean, we're completely having to reorient ourselves to what is normal, what is essential, what is holding our society apart, because we're breaking down to those details right now. And I know that, I mean, when you're looking at a social contract, and that's a term that we learn in social studies, and it seems really vague and abstract. And because what we consider our social contract is so ridiculously intricate uh, in modern American society compared to what they thought of it in the 17 or 1600s, is, back then they were talking about governments that are responsible for safety and welfare of the people, and those were vague terms. But
right.
now today, that welfare can include anything from, do you have proper internet connection, do you have access to electricity?
Yeah.
Those are things that they didn't even have, let alone expect every citizen to be able to have access to. And now that we have, everybody is literally at home having online meetings,
Right.
unless they're on those front lines. Internet does seem like one of those non-negotiable resources.
More like a public utility than some sort of luxury item that
Boy.
you have to pay for, right?
Yeah. I mean, when the internet first came out, I remember being a little kid thinking, this is amazing. If I just sit here and wait 3 minutes, I can download a picture.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, I think our whole concept of what's public utility has completely changed.
Yep. Yep. I do wonder if that's going to be, and thinking just about a social contract or an agreement between all of us that we're going to do and not do certain things. How many conversations will change as a result of that? Because right now, I think it was a couple of years ago, the FCC kind of made the determination that winners and losers could be picked as far as internet, or they weren't going to stop people from changing speeds, changing download, changing upload, different things like that, because there were a fair amount of people arguing that it was a public utility. I wonder, looking at that, okay, is this a basic, will there be more conversations about, is this a basic right? or part of that basic rights bundle: freedom of speech, freedom to access the internet. I don't know, but it'll be interesting to hear those kind
Mm.
of things when you come out on the other side of it, most definitely. So,
So, Bryan, you understand this better than I do. I mean, it's just let's be real here. So, when we founded our country,
mm,
what would you say were the most, I guess, what were the basic tenets of what a social contract was composed of?
there were a lot of components, obviously, and you'd had thinkers. So Europe and people in the Americas, most of Western civilization, if you think about it. So those kind of people who trace their thought and knowledge process ancestry back to Greece, um, to make it very simple like that. We're going through a time that we call the Enlightenment now, and it was kind of a return to not only the classics had been rediscovered, so your Platos and your Aristotles and Socrates were out there again, and then they were being chewed over by people who wanted to know how that changed what we thought about everything from what life was supposed to be. Was it supposed to be all around the church? Was it supposed to be a little bit more than that? Was entertainment and leisure, were those not the immoral things that we thought they were in the medieval period, but rather they were something to be aspired to? And so there were a lot of thoughts, and among them was a resurgence in the interest of the idea of democracy or republic or self-government, that people who were in a government got to have a say in how they were governed, right? And it's probably it's a long explanation about whether or not Greece could actually have been called a democracy as we would think of it, or that
Mhm.
Rome was a republic as we would think of it, and for another time. But there was a time, or several times, where some people, and we'll put a heavy qualifier on that, got to make certain decisions about how they were going to be governed, how they were going to be ruled, um, not without some problems. But the modern, when you get a little bit further into the Enlightenment, you have quite a few guys, and they were mostly guys. There were a lot of women thinking about it. They just didn't get the opportunity to write it down. They came along a little later. Um, and with that, the idea of self-government was also very much contained to rich white guys at this point in time. But the idea that you not only had a say in your government, but there was a reason why you had a say in your government. So you have these two groups of people, or bigger groups of people, that were part of the original 13 colonies, and they've got a lot of subdivisions. But you can think about the people in the South looked more towards the classic model of liberty, right? This kind of libertas thing. So there were going to be a few people who were going to be on top of the societal heap, that were free. They were unburdened by kind of everyday labor, so that they could make decisions for the good of all. It's very much in line with our one of our big Greek heavyweight philosophers, Plato, who said, optimally,
Mhm.
we should be ruled by a philosopher king, but there should be some really smart people who should be making decisions for all of us. So this idea that it was very stratified, but yeah, at the top, you got this group of people who are free to make really good decisions for people, right? They were supposed to have the best interests of everyone at heart, and they were free to make those decisions. On the other side, further north in your New England colonies and places, you had a group of guys that had a very different idea of freedom, one that was kind of brought up in Germany and the Netherlands, where, to be very quick, as the medieval aside, you didn't have, when you think of the medieval period, you think of castles and you think of knights and you think of the feudal system, where everybody worked for, some sort of noble lord, and they gave everything in return for protection. And in Germany and the Netherlands and a few other places like that, it wasn't quite like that. You had a whole lot more independent people, even throughout the medieval period. And so there was this concept of, and in German it's freedom, but in German it's Freiheit, or personal freedom. And it had this idea that every single person had an innate freedom to do what they wanted to do, to be who they wanted to be, and not to be told what to do. And that's a very strong streak with a lot of people who settled in America. You also have a large group of people from Scotland and Ireland who they were the first, we'll call them victims of British imperialism. And had been living in a state of constant border wars for a couple of hundred years. And so when they moved uh, over a period of about 100 years into the middle colonies, what we think of as Appalachia and other areas, they also had a very strong, you're not going to tell me what to do because the last time you did, I got shot, that kind of thing. So these two kind of basic ideas of freedom were very different from each other. But when you have a common adversary that threatens all of them, so for example, the British, who were, took control of New York Harbor, took control of Boston, eventually blockaded the South. And so now, whether you were thinking that you were going to be a philosopher king, kind of looking out for all of your children, or you were going to be threatened with individual freedom, very much like if you think about the Declaration of Independence and that very big name, John Hancock, well, he was a merchant. And so when Boston Harbor was blockaded, he couldn't make any money. And so that was a direct threat to his individual liberty, right? And so you have those two ideas that play together, but then you come together in Philadelphia, and it's an interesting mix of people there. And they all come from very different backgrounds, and don't ever let any other history teacher tell you differently. But there was a common meeting of we are under threat of losing our liberty, whatever definition that is. And if you look at the Declaration of Independence, you can kind of see both of those. You have the statement that all men are born, with certain inalienable rights, and then you also have a list. Most of the Declaration is not necessarily as the high-minded statements of Jefferson at the beginning, which also originally included the manumission of slavery. That was a bad idea and should be gotten rid of. And it was excised because you have a lot of people from the South who own large numbers of slaves, including Jefferson himself. But you have these statements of the King George III has violated our rights like this. He has then done that. He has then done that. And every one of them is kind of dovetailed with the idea that, and we tried to reason with you, and we tried to tell you. And so it's interesting to see both of those kind of basic ideas of liberty at play when you look at the Declaration, then again later at the Constitution. But it is interesting how those two not exact definitions of liberty came together to form what we would have as the foundation of our government.
Well, and I'll put you there is that, like, if you look at the modern American culture today, and you're talking about liberty, I think you can see that all over those intermixing of ideas. Like the battle back then was between, the dividing line was slavery or not slavery. That was the dividing line between all of them, and that was clearly pronounced. But we see these same battles, the illusion, the foundations of those ideas battled all the time in our culture.
Sure.
You have a good portion of the public, we identify them with common terms like liberal or progressive,
Right.
who truly think of terms of, liberty, not just in terms of the absence of governmental oppression, but also if you are in debt or you are not financially secure, you've lost liberty by not having the power over your own life.
Right.
The lack of financial security is a lack of liberty, because you can't afford to do anything. You can't do anything.
Yeah.
Whereas in the conservative movement, or like traditionally conservative movement, has a lot more of that flair of really being consciously aware of the government presence as a threat to their liberty, by that sense of negative liberty, that sense of not having governmental interference.
Absolutely.
We can talk about how those two, hypocritically, go against each other, and but the liberals take this position, and but the conservative, liberals are truly libertarians because look at abortion, and they're telling the government to back off. But conservatives are truly big government because look at the way they get involved in, whatever it might be, put their hand on this project or whatever that might project be. So don't mistake me. There's no consistency when it comes to philosophy.
Not at all.
Because our current government is a composition of two parties which are clobbering together factions that they've added on as a matter of convenience to try to reach 50%.
Yeah, very few of them are actually natural allies. And what's interesting about even after the foundation, you say slavery being a dividing line, it was, but it didn't really become so until after, really after you win the war for independence. And then after that, it becomes something that a relatively small group of people hook onto, and then it grows from there. It's interesting to see the movement kind of move out of there. But from the foundation, these in the political parties we've had, which we were directly warned by George Washington not to have, but um, they really are, like you said, they're cobbled together of convenience. It's a lot more alliance and allegiance, or I think this is going to happen as a result. And that's always going to be heavily influenced by where people came from and what they were taught. And so if you're coming from, if your father or grandfather is coming from an area that was in constant strife, and they were constantly hungry as a result of a big government intervening power, in that case, most cases, the British monarchy, encroaching upon their lives and homes, they're going to be extraordinarily wary of giving any kind of personal autonomy or power away to any government. And that's 350 years ago, but the basic idea of watch out for that government remains with some people. Or the other idea, look at the origin of the Pilgrims, or the larger Puritans that settled New England. They weren't just moving here to be away from England. They were moving here as part of they were socially engineering a new society. That was their whole point, was we are going to make it better. We are going to base it upon what we think that God wants us to do. And they were also extraordinarily strict, to the point of being really awful to those people who didn't fit that relatively narrow mold, because they were going to grow a new one. And with that, the whole premise of government was there to make sure that everybody followed what you decided to lay down. And so this idea of embracing, and you can even see it in a lot of New England and Appalachia and the South today, is that the difference between, we believe government is here to help us and to keep us all into this kind of thing, which obviously has morphed from its puritanical origins, and in the South and other areas where it's like, we don't want you touching the stuff that we do. And it's interesting to see. It's grown, it's changed. You have all kinds of different really strange bedfellows in both of these parties, but to see the foundations kind of pulled forward into this time, at least from these underlying ideas of why we should or shouldn't trust local government, keep regional government, have federal government involvement, is really interesting to see.
No, and I really like, I think that's interesting, the way that we've kind of come to this picture,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of people like to think about the founding fathers as this uniform idea. I loved it. The phrase that I always hear is, the founding fathers would never. Okay, first of all, the founding fathers were a coalition of people that
Right.
didn't even particularly like each other
Correct.
sometimes much. Sometimes they did. You had friendships, I'm sure, involved, but
Mm-hmm.
they had wildly divergent ideas about what society should look like. And that's part of the reason our Constitution is inherently vague.
Mm-hmm.
It was created because you had to come up with, or they did come up with, a unanimous document. But how often do you get a room full of, God, how many men were involved? Over 100,
Over 100, and you have to remember that some of them they're coming from, like I said earlier, puritanical backgrounds, large English gentry plantations, all the way to, in the Carolinas, they were settled by the sons and grandsons of chattel slave lords from Barbados, who had no interest in giving away any kind of rights whatsoever. So put all of those guys in a room in July in Philadelphia, it's
You're going to come up with a vague document. You
absolutely
want general principles, no specificity, and that we've reaped the consequences of that, and that everybody looks to the Constitution with a different eye of what they read out of it, because some people who describe themselves as literalists say you've got to go by the word for word. Other people say you can't do that practically, so let's take the broad strokes and
right.
combine that with international law and public understanding, and revised definitions as we've come to understand them as public.
Mm-hmm.
And you have this disagreement because the definitions that are given in those, they're not very clear all the time.
No.
And so um, you know, we talk about,
In any other place, a court case like Marbury versus Madison, which was settled right after the Constitution, not too long afterwards, which was over a bridge, is now a 200 plus year uh, 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 previous judgment idea by which almost all interstate commerce is decided. It's
Mhm.
in those kind of really interesting things. It's why, you know, if you ever ask any lawyer or person who studied the Constitution, and they should be able to come up with that case pretty quickly, because when you're talking about how you regulate something that was not specifically laid down in a document, well, how do you do it? And then through the court process, you come up with all kinds of really interesting ways in which this has worked for the last couple of hundred years. But from one result, as it was written to be intentionally vague because we needed a majority of people to approve it. Because keep in mind, when they came for the Constitutional Convention, we'd been functioning as a confederation for several years at that point in time. And for some states, it was not going well at all. For others, it was going just fine. And they didn't all come there under the pretense of crafting a new governmental system. It really didn't. So it
and
was very
so some people here right now are going to be like, okay, so why is it that we're talking about all this during the middle of the coronavirus? What is it? How does it even come back to this? How does the virus even, all this even matter to the virus? Because, you know, I think you and I have talked about how um, the questions that we're having right now relate directly back to questions about why we even have a government.
right.
What's the purpose? We have some officials who have made public health their number one priority, that, you know, save as many lives as possible, get as much equipment out as possible. You know, other people, the economy is clearly their number one priority.
Right.
And they're talking about, including our president, get back to work,
Right.
get people back to work.
Yeah.
How do we keep the Dow going? How do we keep our economic prosperity going, you know, during this crisis?
Mhm.
And, you know, there's a good middle in between that seem to have put this on a rubric, and some people have health here and economy here. Some people have economy here and health here.
Right.
And they're figuring out how many lives per economic gain can we, you know, solve. And so there is a question of what is the priority. And, you know, people for the first time are told that they have to go home.
Mhm.
And their whole life that the government's forcing you to go home.
Right.
And there is a pushback in our society. You can't tell me to do that. You can't make me go home.
Yep.
And government is, in most places, now there's some states that aren't following along, but they're saying no. And
Yep.
you know, there's some states that the enforcement's not there. The president has not set a national standard.
Right.
Sometimes going county by county. It's quite frankly a mess. It's a patchwork. And so some people would say that's the natural guidance of the federal system. But really we're encountering a crisis of conscience about how we should be handling this, because we all come at different ideas of what the role of the government is in this situation.
Absolutely.
And
Far more
so,
deep-seated than any one national crisis, but it brings these regional distinctions and personal philosophies to the forefront when, you know, because you do have people who, well, it's really easy to say, flattening the curve on the coronavirus is our national priority right now. And then people who are totally dedicated to that idea would look at anybody else who's running any kind of economic numbers right now and think that they're just a barbarian for even considering those kind of things. But then you have to look at what other people, you know, you're brought up to think, okay, the government is not going to solve my problems. We are going to solve our problems. It's, if you read between the lines for a lot of press conferences that I have seen in regards to testing kits and vaccinations and different things, they continue to bring up the idea that private industry is involved and private institutions are involved. And this is what's going to happen through private companies. And there are lots of people who are very highly focused in on the idea that that is how this works, that free enterprise, and we'll put an asterisk or quotes around that as well, is the idea, that's the preeminent thing that we are protecting here. We are protecting everybody's idea to be entrepreneurial, to move forward. And for a lot of people, that is the foundational idea of America. Whereas for other people, the foundational idea of America is that we take care of Americans. And there are lots of other foundational ideas, but what's interesting to see is how they play or don't play very well with each other. Because there are a lot of people right now, like you said, they're looking for federal guidance on these kind of things. And then there are a lot of other people who could care less if there's any federal guidance, and in fact might actively fight against it. And to see that play out state by state, as you said, even county by county, sometimes, not all the counties in our area. Up until yesterday, I think I could go to a county that's not too far away from me and find that there was no, I think Harris County was called stay at home or shelter in place or whatever. And even the language of it, how soft or how hard it is greatly dependent upon everybody's view of what it was, of what this thing called government is, which is, it's an interesting time to be watching government, I think, in general. But
Well, I know that we're probably getting close to what, 30, 45 minutes.
yeah.
So, I just kind of want to end on, one thought, which is that, um, I don't think that, I think everyone wants to think there's a correct way to read this.
Mm-hmm.
I think everyone wants to think that, nothing except the virus matters at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And some people want to think that if we don't have an economy to come back to when this is over, then we've destroyed America, the American future.
Right.
And so I think as we're going forward into this, I think it's very easy to devalue the considerations of somebody else. Now, I think we have some clearly egregious examples, like the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, for example, where it goes beyond anything that's socially acceptable,
Yep.
or morally acceptable to say. But I think that part of the reason why we were able to come up with a stable fabric of our society was because you did have those different values coming to
Mm-hmm.
a constitutional convention
Right.
and inserting those values in. And, through that process, we have over time as a country winnowed in on the values that are important to us, because we have continued that fight between diverging values and bringing those together in that situation. So,
Right.
we went from a country of white male slave owning landowners who dominated everything to where, people who were not rich, people who were not property owners, people who were of African descent, people who are of Irish descent. Goodness, like you're talking about women when you're talking about the LGBT community. We've over the year chipped away at that by coming at it with these diverging ideas of what it means for our future.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we would be remiss to not understand the different foundations of what people are coming at this equation for.
Mm-hmm.
And people who are health oriented, who are social safety oriented,
Mm-hmm.
can bring something different to this crisis than someone who is economically focused.
Right.
But only if we're using those ideas in a cooperative manner.
Right. And probably not only that, but understanding where people are coming from, the moment. And like you said, there are egregious examples which need to be shouted down, no matter where you're at. But there are a lot of people who are relying on a lot of past experience and a lot of regional, just a regional understanding of our country that we may not have, or that we may not have had that experience. That's the whole point, was to kind of bring everything together. And people will fight very hard to preserve what they think that they've had until they see something that's different and better. And I think that's probably, it's a good thing to talk about where we came from, so that we can all kind of understand where we want to go with this, because this is a turning point. And I don't think it's too much. I don't step too much out on a limb to say that we're going to come out of this differently, and where we decide to take that, where that direction is going to take us, is going to matter very much on whether or not we decided to work with each other, to hear each other, or not.
Mm-hmm.
So,
All right. Well, we will certainly be recording another one of these soon.
very much.
TBD win, TBD win. But I think it's important that we're having these conversations, whether it's you and me, whether anybody who's listening is taking these conversations out to their loved ones. It's a really tense time. It's
Mhm.
hard to have conversations because people are angry, people are scared. Um, but if you're not having these conversations of where we're going as a country, you're missing the opportunity. You're missing the opportunity to where we can not just take this terrible tragedy and survive through it, but grow from it.
Right. Right.
So,
And most of you are at home, so you've got the time to watch. Just throwing it.
all right. Well, you have a good night, Brian.
You too, Chris. We'll talk to you guys soon.
All right, bye.